Nikola Tesla once claimed that ancient people may have understood electricity long before modern science. Most experts laughed it off as the strange idea of a forgotten genius. But in 1936, near Baghdad, a small 2,000-year-old clay jar was pulled from the ground. Inside were copper, iron, and a sealed design that looked almost exactly like a simple battery. When researchers tested replicas, the result was not myth, not legend, but measurable current. So what did Tesla know? And why did history look away? Tesla said something that should have been impossible. Tesla's strangest idea was not only about future machines. It pointed back toward the ancient world, where he believed people may have understood natural power long before modern science named it electricity. In the early 1900s, Nikola Tesla spoke about hidden forces with unusual confidence, even as many scientists dismissed him. By 1943, the year he died, his image had changed from brilliant inventor to lonely outsider, and that made his ancient electricity ideas easier for critics to ignore. Ancient sources became the ground of this mystery. Tesla and later supporters of this idea looked towards Sanskrit writings, Vedic descriptions of energy, and old images from Egypt that seemed to show unusual forms of light. These claims are debated, and they do not prove that ancient people had modern power systems. But they create a strange question. Why do texts from thousands of years ago speak so often about force, fire, light, and invisible power? Ark of the Covenant became the most powerful part of the argument because its design sounded technical. It was described as a chest made from acacia wood, covered with gold inside and outside, and carried with strict rules. Tesla compared this idea to a Leyden jar, an early electrical device used in the 1700s to store charge. Wood could act as separation, gold could conduct, and that simple structure made the ancient object feel less like only a symbol. Baghdad's clay object later gave this story a sharper edge. Found near Baghdad, the jar contained a copper tube, an iron rod, and space where liquid may have been placed. Some researchers suggested it could have worked like a simple battery around 2,000 years ago, though others strongly disagree. It did not prove Tesla was right. Still, it left one uncomfortable thought behind. Maybe ancient people did not master electricity, but maybe they had touched small pieces of it before us. Baghdad, 1936. The jar nobody was looking for. Baghdad's Iraq Museum held many forgotten objects, but one small jar pulled Wilhelm König into a strange mystery. He was not an archaeologist or a famous scientist. He worked as the director of the Antique Restoration Workshop, handling broken, buried, and ignored pieces from the past. In 1936, while going through old items from the Parthian period, he noticed something that did not feel like a normal storage vessel. Kujut Rabu, a site just outside Baghdad, had produced the object that caught his eye. At first, it looked simple. A small terracotta clay jar, about 5.5 inches tall, sealed at the top with black asphalt. Nothing about it looked royal, sacred, or expensive. But König was trained to notice structure, and the sealed top made him look closer instead of putting it back with the rest. Inside the asphalt plug, König saw a copper cylinder fixed neatly in place. Inside that cylinder sat an iron rod, held upright and centered, without touching the copper walls. That detail was hard to explain as decoration. The clay jar, the copper tube, and the iron rod formed 3 layers, each separated from the other. In simple terms, it looked like the basic setup of a galvanic cell, where different metals can create a small electric charge when liquid is added. König's discovery did not prove that ancient people had modern electricity, and it did not prove every theory about ancient power was true. But the design was too specific to ignore. A jar from around 2,000 years ago, linked to the Parthian world, had the same basic parts used in simple batteries: iron, copper, and space for a liquid reaction. König was not looking for a battery. Nobody was. That is what made the object so unsettling. It seemed to be waiting quietly in a museum shelf, holding a question history had never planned to ask. What this object actually is, and why it shouldn't exist. Battery science starts with a simple rule. You need 2 metals, a liquid path, and a way for charge to move. A basic galvanic cell works when one metal gives up electrons and another receives them. In the Baghdad jar, the setup looks strangely familiar. The copper cylinder could act as one electrode, while the iron rod could act as the other. Between them was empty space, where a liquid could sit and carry the reaction forward. Ancient Mesopotamia had the liquids needed for that reaction. Simple acidic fluids like vinegar, tamarind juice, or fermented grape juice were available in daily life. If one of these filled the jar, it could work as an electrolyte, allowing a small current to form between the metals. That is why the object feels so strange. It was not shaped like a modern 1800 CE battery, but the inside followed the same basic idea. Asphalt seal makes the mystery harder to dismiss. Black asphalt closed the top and held the iron rod in place without letting it touch the copper cylinder. That separation matters because if the metals touched directly, the charge would short out and the device would fail. A potter could make a jar. A craftsman could shape metal. But keeping 3 layers apart like this suggests someone understood the need for control, even if they did not use modern electrical words. Modern replica tests gave the jar a measurable result. When researchers filled copies with a 5% acetic acid solution, close to common vinegar, some produced around 1.1 to 2 volts of current. That was not enough to power a city, but it was enough to prove the design could create steady electrical flow. Alessandro Volta is still credited with building the first known battery in 1800 CE. Yet this object may be over 2,000 years older, carrying the same basic principle in a clay body nobody expected. Koenig tells the world, and the world looks away. Wilhelm Koenig did not keep the strange jar to himself. After studying it for 2 years, he published his idea in 1938 under the title Ein galvanisches Element aus der Partherzeit. The meaning was simple. Could this be a galvanic cell from the Parthian period? His paper was careful and detailed, but it landed in a world that had no space for ancient electricity. Europe was already moving toward disaster when Koenig tried to raise the alarm. In 1938, Hitler had annexed Austria, and World War II was only about 6 months away. Scholars were focused on politics, fear, and survival, not a small clay jar from Baghdad. So the paper did not create a serious debate. It slipped into the background, almost like the object had been buried all over again. Archaeologists who answered Koenig did not accept his battery idea. Some argued the copper cylinder and iron rod were not electrical parts at all, but supports for sacred papyrus scrolls. Koenig pushed back because the asphalt seal and possible acidic liquid made that explanation weak in his eyes. Paper would not survive well inside that kind of sealed setup. Still, his problem was clear. He was a museum workshop director arguing against trained professors. Koenig's career never received the recognition this discovery might have deserved. He died in 1959, about 21 years after publishing his theory, with no major scientific award and no rewrite of electricity's official story. The jar remained tied to the Iraq Museum, the Parthian mystery stayed debated, and the textbooks continued to credit Alessandro Volta in 1800 CE. Koenig had pointed at something strange, but the world looked away before the question could fully breathe. Tesla was dying at the same moment Koenig was being ignored. Koenig's paper was fading into silence in 1938, and at nearly the same time, Nikola Tesla was near the end of his life. He was 82 years old, living alone in room 3327 of the New Yorker hotel, far from the fame he once had. His big laboratory work was over, his funding had mostly disappeared, and stories from his final years describe a man surviving on simple habits, including warm milk and honey. Tesla's larger idea had always been that ancient people may have understood energy in ways modern science refused to take seriously. He connected Vedic ideas, electromagnetic forces, and wireless power into one strange picture. His dream at Wardenclyffe Tower on Long Island was to send energy across distance, without wires, using the Earth and atmosphere as part of the system. To Tesla, this was not magic, it was nature, if humans learned how to use it. Tesla's death in 1943 added another dark turn to the story. After he died in the New Yorker hotel, officials from the US Office of Alien Property collected his papers, notebooks, letters, and technical material. Many accounts mention around 80 trunks connected to his work. The official concern was national security, because Tesla had spent decades writing about high voltage, frequencies, wireless transmission, and unusual electrical systems. Koenig and Tesla were two ignored men standing on different sides of the same mystery. Koenig had a strange object from Baghdad, linked to the Parthian period and published in 1938. Tesla had the bigger theory, shaped by years of work with electricity before his death in 1943. One held the possible physical clue. The other had spent his life talking about hidden energy. Neither man was fully believed, and for another 30 years, the question stayed quiet. Had the ancient world touched electricity long before modern history was ready to admit it? The scientists who finally took it seriously. Serious testing of the Baghdad battery began much later, around the 1970s, when German researcher Arne Egebrecht decided to stop treating the jar like a museum oddity. As director of the Roma and Pelizaeus Museum, he built a working replica to see what the object could actually do. The idea was simple. If the jar's copper, iron, and liquid chamber worked together, then it should create a small current. Gold plating became the test that made the object harder to ignore. Egebrecht reportedly used grape juice as the electrolyte and connected the replica to a small silver statuette. The current was weak, but steady enough to place a thin layer of gold over the surface. That matched what Wilhelm Koenig had suggested about 35 years earlier. Maybe these jars were not made for power in the modern sense, but for coating objects with precious metal. Ancient artifacts raised an even stranger question after that. Some old Egyptian objects had gold layers so thin and smooth that they looked similar to electroplating. For years, many people assumed such pieces were made from solid gold or covered by methods fully understood by historians. Egebrecht's test did not prove every artifact was electroplated, but it showed that a small ancient-style battery could create that kind of finish. That was enough to make the old explanation feel less complete. Willard Gray had already tested the idea earlier at the General Electric High Voltage Laboratory in 1940. Using materials available in ancient Mesopotamia, he showed that a replica could produce stable current. Later reports also connect replica testing to places like the Smithsonian Institution and museums in Berlin, with the same basic result: the jar could generate electricity. Still, no major history book was rewritten. No loud announcement followed. The evidence did not explode into public view. It stayed quiet, sitting between science and history, asking why a 2,000-year-old clay jar could act like a battery at all. 10 jars. This was never an accident. Similar jars from Kujut Rabu made the mystery harder to explain as one strange mistake. The famous Baghdad battery was not described as a lone object sitting apart from everything else. Reports say several vessels with the same basic design were recovered from the same area near Baghdad. Each one followed the same pattern: a clay jar, a copper cylinder, an iron rod, and asphalt used to hold the parts apart. Repeated design is what makes this story feel different. One jar could be an accident, a broken storage pot, or a misunderstood tool. But around 10 similar vessels with the same inner structure point toward a method. Copper, iron, and asphalt were not placed together randomly, again and again. Someone knew how these parts had to sit inside the jar, even if they did not explain it in the words we use today. Parthian dating places these objects in a very old window, roughly 250 BCE to 224 CE. That is about 474 years, long enough for a skill to pass from one worker to another. If these jars were really used for electrochemical work, then this was not a single lucky experiment. It would mean several generations of artisans knew how to build the same device, repeat the same structure, and keep the same working idea alive. Connected jars raise an even bigger question. A single replica can create a small current, but 3 jars joined together could increase the output, possibly reaching around 6 volts depending on the liquid and build. That would be enough for thin metal coating, small experiments, or uses we still cannot prove. No one can honestly claim the Parthians had modern electricity, but these jars leave a sharper question behind. If this was a real working method, who taught them? How long did they use it? And why did the knowledge disappear so completely from history? The theories that try to explain the unexplainable. Mainstream archaeologists give the safest explanation for the Baghdad battery. They argue that these jars may have been used for electroplating, a process where a thin layer of metal covers another object. In simple terms, a cheap item could be coated with gold or silver to make it look richer. This would explain the copper, iron, and acidic liquid without claiming that the Parthians had modern electricity. It keeps the story small, useful, clever, but not world-changing. Ancient medicine gives the mystery a different angle. Some old records mention people using electric fish, including the Nile torpedo ray, to ease pain, headaches, and gout. A fish shock is not the same as a battery, but the idea is not impossible to understand. If ancient healers noticed that electric shock could numb pain, then a small controlled current may have seemed useful. That does not prove the jar was a medical tool, but it gives the theory a reason to exist. Tesla's wider idea moved far beyond jewelry or pain treatment. Nikola Tesla thought ancient people may have received knowledge from an older source, not slowly discovered it by trial and error. He looked at Vedic mathematics, ancient cosmology, and repeated images of light and power in different cultures. This is where the claim becomes much harder to prove. The patterns are interesting, but patterns alone cannot prove a lost global electrical science. Dendera reliefs in Egypt are often pulled into the same debate because some writers say the carvings look like early electrical lamps. These reliefs are linked to around 50 BCE, close to the wider time period connected with the Baghdad jars. Mainstream scholars explain them as religious images, not light bulbs. Still, the timeline keeps people asking questions. No major field called archaeoelectricity has fully taken ownership of this mystery, so the debate stays trapped between archaeology, engineering, and speculation. The jars can make current. The harder question is, what ancient people actually used that current for? 2003. History gets looted. Baghdad's National Museum of Iraq turned into a crime scene on April 10, 2003, only 3 days after US forces entered the city. In about 36 hours, thousands of ancient objects were stolen, smashed, or carried away. Reports place the loss between 7,000 and 15,000 artifacts. These were not just old museum pieces. They were parts of Mesopotamia, Babylon, Assyria, and Iraq's deepest memory. Baghdad Battery's original artifact was pulled into that chaos. This was the same object linked to Wilhelm König, the Iraq Museum, and the 1938 theory that it may have worked like a simple battery. After the looting, its public status became unclear. Some accounts suggest it may have been moved into storage before the invasion. Others leave open the possibility that it disappeared during the attack. No clear public record has fully settled where the Baghdad battery is today. Iraq's cultural loss did not stop with one building. In 2015, ISIS destroyed parts of the Mosul Museum, burned rare material from the Mosul Library, and attacked ancient places tied to the same region. Nimrud, a 3,000-year-old Assyrian city, was also bulldozed. These were not random ruins. They held carvings, tablets, manuscripts, and objects that connected modern people to some of the oldest cities on Earth. Warnings about the museum had been raised before the invasion. Cultural experts told US officials that the Iraq Museum needed protection, and the danger was known. But the building was not secured in time. That failure is what makes this part of the story so heavy. The object at the center of the Baghdad battery debate may now be missing, damaged, or hidden from public view. It did not vanish because time buried it. It may have vanished because history was left unguarded. What Tesla knew that we still won't accept. Tesla saw history as a cycle, not a straight climb upward. Across nearly 4 decades, he argued that civilizations rise, learn powerful things, collapse, and leave only broken pieces behind. To him, electricity was not something humans discovered once and then kept forever. He thought earlier people may have touched the same force, used it in simple ways, and then lost the knowledge through war, time, or disaster. Baghdad battery makes that idea uncomfortable because it does not attack modern science. It attacks the neat timeline we like to trust. History books say Alessandro Volta built the first battery in 1800 CE, but the Baghdad jar is linked to a world more than 2,000 years older. Replica tests showed it could produce a small current, and that alone creates a problem. Maybe the past was not advanced like us, but maybe it was not as simple as we were taught. Koenig stood at the center of that problem in 1938 when he pointed to the jar and suggested it may have worked as a galvanic cell. Later, other tests added more pressure: copper, iron, acidic liquid, and even possible electroplating. Then came the other loose threads: Vedic energy language, Egyptian objects with thin gold layers, Tesla's seized papers in 1943, and the museum chaos of 2003. None of these pieces proves a lost electrical empire, but together, they keep asking why the question was never seriously chased. Silence is what follows every layer of this story. Someone notices the pattern, someone tests the object, someone confirms it can work, and then the subject drifts back into the shadows. Not always because of a secret plot, often because schools, museums, and experts move slowly, and old timelines are hard to rewrite. So the final question is not just whether ancient people knew electricity, it is whether we are doing the same thing now, learning, building, forgetting, and leaving behind objects that future people may not understand.